12 apostles. Early in the second year of Jesus' ministry, Jesus was involved in a series of confrontations with the Jewish religious leaders. Jesus used these confrontations not only to contend against religious tradition and legalism, but also to make his most concerted appeal to the Jewish leaders. He had challenged them to accept his divinity and his lordship, and he had invited them to accept the righteousness and justification, and from there the salvation that was on offer to them, not by the Jewish law with its customs and regulations, but by believing in Jesus himself and learning from him. For the first year of his ministry, Jesus had tried to witness specially to the Jewish leadership. His appeals to them at the beginning of what would be his second year of ministry were Jesus' way of eliciting a response or decision from them, whether in his favor or not. And you can read about this appeal, especially from about John chapter 5. But the outcome of these confrontations was that the scribes and Pharisees became so enraged by Jesus that they then held a council to plan how to destroy him. Destroy doesn't just mean to overthrow his ministry or to discredit him, but I suspect that even at this early stage, they wanted to see him dead. Mark chapter 3 verse 6 says that these religious Jews joined up with the Herodians, who were a secular or political Jewish party. These two groups, the religious and the political, seem to have cooperated over the past year to put John the Baptist in prison and to end his preaching work, and now they were plotting together again to try to end Jesus' ministry as well. When Jesus had learnt that John the Baptist had been imprisoned, then his response had been to leave Judea, which of course was the main centre of religious Judaism. He left Judea and Jerusalem, of course, and departed to Galilee. And now, at Matthew 12, verse 15, for example, it tells us that when Jesus knew about the plot to destroy himself, so again he then withdrew and moved to a different location. Mark chapter 3 verse 7 says that he and his close disciples withdrew to the Sea of Galilee. This move by Jesus represented something of a turning point and a new phase or a new chapter in his public ministry. Whereas up until now Jesus had been directing his witness particularly to the Jewish religious leaders, from now on his main attention would be on the common people, and it would be, of course, much more extensive throughout the land. And while the leadership of the Jews would show more hostility to Jesus progressively, the common people during the second year would show great enthusiasm and even adulation for Jesus. By withdrawing himself to the Sea of Galilee, Jesus made himself less exposed to the hostile, hardline Jewish leaders. It was comparatively easy for Jesus to move back and forth across the lake undetected and unhindered if it was necessary. The Sea of Galilee was a place covered in fishing boats, and there were many villages around its shores, and obviously Jesus could move to any one of those villages, crossing the lake amongst the other boats, and be comparatively difficult to detect one way or the other. And so in this way he could either avoid contact with unwelcome company, or he could escape from difficult or hostile people. Another advantage of the Lake District of Galilee was that it was very central and very accessible to a lot of people. From this one region, Jesus' ministry could reach more people than it could have done from any other one part of Palestine. It was surrounded by several different provincial districts. It was at the crossroads or the hub of at least 4 major trade and caravan centres. They were Damascus, Tyre, Samaria, and Gerasa. And even though Galilee was not a large province, only about 50 square kilometres, or I should say only about 50 kilometres square, which is a different thing than saying 50 square kilometres. So it was about 50 by 50 kilometres. It would be, for example, similar in size or area to the farming district between Whanganui and Palmerston North. I'm sorry to anyone listening in America or Europe. You'd have to work it out for yourself. And yet, this comparatively small area, even by Israeli or Palestinian standards, it seems to have supported a very large population base indeed. Now, Josephus was a Jewish historian, famously, and he lived during the 1st century and was for a few years a general of the Jewish armed forces of Galilee. His records suggest that Galilee had a population of over 3 million. He said that there were 204 villages with at least 15,000 people. He mentioned by name about 40 cities and villages in Galilee, and this compares favourably with the book of Joshua, which named about 60 cities in exactly the same region in his day. Now, obviously, Joshua lived about 1,500 years before Josephus, but obviously the figures that they come up with in terms of the number of villages are certainly comparable. Around the lake itself in Jesus' day, there were at least 12 cities that we know of today. Many of them are not even mentioned or hinted at in the New Testament. One was Tarichea, which had a major industry salting and pickling fish. Josephus said this city had a population of 40,000, so it's comparable to our own city of Whanganui. Tarichea also had a fishing fleet of 230 boats. The biggest city at the lake was Tiberias. It was a Gentile city established by Herod the Great and was only about 10 kilometres south of Jesus' base at Capernaum. With these historical and geographical details in mind, we can more clearly imagine that Jesus, as he walked around the Galilee region, would have come to a village perhaps every 3 to 4 kilometres on average. So Jesus would go from one village, walk maybe half an hour to an hour, and immediately come across another village or small town. He would cross paths with tens of thousands of people in just one day of travelling. The majority of those people would normally be Jewish, but often Jesus would encounter Gentiles who could be locals or visitors or travellers just passing along the main trade routes. Many of these would be impoverished people, but many of them would be fabulously wealthy, traders in large entourages from other parts of the world. The Jewish festivals of Passover and Pentecost, which both took place in the spring 7 weeks apart, were major religious events which attracted Jews and proselytes from many countries outside of Israel into Israel and to the city of Jerusalem. For example, Acts 2 refers to visitors in Jerusalem at Pentecost from 15 different countries. I believe that Jesus' withdrawal to Galilee happened soon after Pentecost, at a time when the reports of his miracles had been taken back from Jerusalem to the homelands of the tens of thousands of religious travellers. This would explain the sudden wave of interest that Jesus began to receive from people of several foreign districts. Now, you may be able to look at some of those districts in your Bible maps of Israel or Judea in the time of Jesus. We'll refer now to Mark chapter 3, which gives some indication of the broad extent from which people were coming to come under Jesus' ministry, obviously from the reports that they had heard about him in these faraway lands. Mark chapter 3, verses 7 through 8 says that Jesus withdrew to the sea with his disciples, and a great multitude from Galilee followed, and also people from Judea and from Jerusalem and from Idumea, which was even further south than Jerusalem, and beyond the Jordan, so that is east of the Jordan, and from the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon, which was north of Galilee along the coast of Lebanon or Phoenicia. Mark says a great multitude heard of all that Jesus was doing, and they came to him. So also Matthew 4 verse 24, which describes the same event, says that the news about Jesus went out into all Syria. So that would suggest that it was going as far afield as Damascus and maybe even further afield than that. Matthew goes on to say, they, the people from Syria, brought to Jesus all who were ill or diseased or in pain. So not only were they hearing about his speaking ministry, but they were hearing about Jesus' wonder-working and his miracles of healing. Now, verse 25 of Matthew 4 mentions that great multitudes followed him, not only from the east beyond Jordan, which probably refers to Perea, but maybe even into the lands around Arabia, but Matthew goes on to say also from Decapolis, which was famously a Greek settlement. Obviously, a lot of the people there were natives, but the culture was predominantly Greek or Hellenistic. Luke's record at chapter 6, verse 17, emphasizes a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon. These different regions altogether make up a large area and cover almost the whole of the promised land. People were possibly coming to Jesus from as far away as Damascus, 100 kilometers northeast of Galilee, and as far south as, say, Beersheba, 200 kilometers away from Galilee. Many of these regions were not particularly Jewish, but had populations which were mainly Phoenician or Canaanite or Arabic or of Greek ancestry. One notable region that isn't mentioned is Samaria. This is consistent with the fact that Samaritans did not worship God at Jerusalem, and neither did they have friendly contact with the Jews as a rule. Here then was another way that Jesus' public ministry had entered a new phase since his withdrawal from the Jewish leaders. Besides being more focused on the common Jewish people, Jesus was now available to the non-Jewish people as well. I'm not suggesting that Jesus was proclaiming that the Gentiles would be part and parcel of his church at this stage, but he was obviously available to these people, and he knew that the experience of receiving people from these hinterlands was a sign or a signal or a foretaste of what would come with the ultimate preaching ministry, the evangelization of the apostles and others. Mark tells us that the multitude of people came to Jesus because they had heard about what he had done and was still doing. This would refer to his miracles of healing, and so the motivation of most of the people was surely a physical, natural one, to get relief from pain or sickness or disability. It would seem that most of these people were motivated to be with Jesus for their own immediate short-term natural benefit, and not so much for their eternal spiritual benefit. Although Jesus, being greater even than Solomon, may have received visitors in the same way that Solomon received the Queen of Sheba, who came to Solomon because not only had she heard of his wealth and the expanse of his kingdom, but she had also heard of his great wisdom. And so I would like to think that many people were making the trek to Galilee to find Jesus and hear him because they had heard about the knowledge and understanding and wisdom that he was imparting through his ministry. To Jesus, of course, the most important need which he recognized was not so much natural physical healing, but spiritual healing, of course. Jesus knew that natural cures and healings could only provide temporary advantages for a person's natural mortal life, whereas spiritual healing, which repairs a person's relationship with God, this has the eternal advantage of new, strong, healthy character and the ultimate reward of eternal life. Because of this, Jesus was careful to keep a right balance between the different natural and spiritual aspects of his ministry. So even though he was compassionate and caring and gracious enough to heal people of their physical ailments, he did not neglect or ignore their even greater need for moral and devotional teaching and instruction. This is why we read in Mark again, chapter 3, verses 9 to 10, "He told his disciples that a boat should stand ready for him because of the multitude, in order that they might not crowd him. And he healed many, with the result that all those who had afflictions pressed about him in order to touch him. The water of the lake formed a barrier between Jesus and the people. Probably not all the people, but the majority of them. And it discouraged or prevented them from physically jostling or crushing him. Obviously, if even the water got crowded with people swimming out to the boat could be moved further out into deeper water. It also meant that Jesus could speak to the crowd without being interrupted or overwhelmed, and obviously speaking out over a broad expanse of flat water created a very good amphitheatre effect for the large crowds on the shore. So Jesus is speaking to the crowd from the boat without being interrupted or overwhelmed, and his desire to make his word ministry his main priority is also the reason we read at Mark 3 verses 11 through 12, "Whenever the unclean spirits beheld him, they would fall down before him and cry out, saying, 'You are the Son of God.' And he earnestly warned them not to make him known." Matthew's Gospel says that Jesus gave the same instruction to everyone who was healed, not only to people with unclean spirits. Now in Matthew's Gospel, it continues at Matthew 12 verse 17 by saying that this policy of Jesus fulfilled a prophecy from Isaiah 42 verse 2, which says that the Messiah will not cry out or raise his voice, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. This is saying that Jesus would not publicize or advertise himself or his ministry. He would not be ostentatious, as it were. He would not flaunt or show off his miracles. So to that extent, Jesus' ministry was not spectacular. It was not something that was wonderful to behold from a distance amongst the crowds. It was what he had to say that really ministered to the crowds, whereas the actual miracles were done on a much more intimate, personal, close manner. The reason for this was so that his miracles would not attract people and distract them from his teaching ministry. Jesus did not want large crowds of excited, maybe even hysterical people to interfere with his teaching and preaching. And so he tried to ensure that those people who had been healed would keep the matter quiet, keep it within their own small company, and not attract more people for healing themselves. Matthew's quote from Isaiah includes a word which means quarrel. So it is possible that Jesus was also trying not to attract the attention of any people who might end up being disputative or hostile, particularly the Jewish leaders, of course, who would have dragged Jesus into disputes and debates and arguments. Now, this stage of Jesus' ministry, which saw the first waves of crowds coming to Jesus from throughout Israel and from countries beyond Israel, was a very important messianic sign, according to Matthew. This was a sign given by God. His quotation from Isaiah 42 says, "Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he shall proclaim justice to the Gentiles, and in his name the Gentiles will hope," or in his name the Gentiles will put their trust. Matthew was quoting Isaiah to show that this ministry, which Jesus was now involved in, was God's way of identifying and vindicating his promised Messiah. God was indicating that Jesus was that special, unique seed or offspring of Abraham through whom God would bless the people of all nations, as he had prophesied back in Genesis 22, verse 18. God was showing that whereas the Jewish religious leadership were rejecting Jesus, God had fully accepted him. God was saying through Isaiah chapter 42, "Behold, look and see, this man is my servant. I have chosen him. I love him, and I take pleasure in him." And the evidence or proof of God's assessment of Jesus was three things according to Isaiah. Firstly, God's Holy Spirit demonstrated by miracles and by inspired teaching. Secondly, Christ's humble demeanor, not loud or ostentatious. And three, God's influence on the Gentiles, that they would be blessed by him. So this new wave of multitudes coming to Jesus from the neighboring Gentile regions was part of the sign which God had arranged and orchestrated to show to Israel that Jesus truly was their promised Messiah, whether or not the Jewish religious leaders believed in him. It would be reasonable to suppose that this stage of Jesus' ministry took place over several weeks. And if my suggestion is correct that the Feast of Pentecost had already passed, then Jesus is ministering now during summer. Summer in Israel from June through to September is generally very warm and dry with no rainfall at all. In the Galilee region, much of which is below sea level, it can be piping hot. Probably at least one of the reasons that Jesus resorted to some of the high hills during his ministry in that region at that time of the year. It can also be very humid in Galilee at this time. Even though the grain crops are already harvested by this time, there are other fruits to tend to and to harvest during these months. Pomegranates, grapes and figs would all be harvested by the end of summer. Significantly, all these fruits are used as symbols of God's people, Israel, and ultimately, of course, of God's people from throughout the world. And Jesus would have appreciated that during this time of ministry, he was himself tending and harvesting spiritual fruit by making many new converts and disciples from among the crowds. We considered a minute ago the fact that the huge numbers of people coming to Jesus were a sign given by God of his approval and vindication of Jesus' messiahship. This sign was God's reply or even a rebuke to the negative, critical Jewish religious leaders, not only to show the leaders how wrong they were to reject Jesus himself when they could clearly see God at work in his ministry, but it was also to show that whereas they had refused the blessing and honour of joining themselves to Jesus, there were many other people from among the common Jews and even the Gentiles whom God and Christ were pleased to invite. The Jewish religious leaders who thought they were in a special elite relationship with God were not indispensable. They were definitely not irreplaceable in God's eyes. So if Jesus could not enlist or recruit close disciples from among the religious leadership, that wasn't his problem. God could provide Jesus with close disciples and comrades from among the multitudes of common people. And so it was at this stage of Jesus' ministry, almost halfway through his public ministry, in fact, that Jesus set about to choose a special group of select disciples. And I was much exercised by what Barry shared this morning concerning partiality and prejudice and bias and preferences as we all commonly experience. Jesus would have been much exercised as to how to choose the ones that would be best to fill the role of his apostles. By comparing Matthew 5 verse 1, Mark 3 verses 13 through 15, and Luke 6 verses 12 through 13, we can tell that on a particular day when Jesus was surrounded by the multitudes, while the Jewish leaders were discussing how to destroy him, Jesus went away to a mountain to pray alone. He continued praying to God all night, which suggests that the subject of this prayer time was extraordinarily significant and important. And when it was daytime again, he summoned certain people to come to him who were all disciples. We don't know how many he actually summoned. This suggests to me that Jesus knew every one of them by name, and from this group of disciples, he specifically chose 12 men whom he named apostles, which means ones sent forth or ones sent out. Jesus appointed these apostles that they might continually be with him and be sent by him to preach and to have authority to cure people of demons. Some manuscripts add that they would also have power or authority to cure diseases as well, according to Mark 3 verse 15. It would seem that God had given Jesus full freedom and responsibility to select his 12 apostles, because we read many times in the Gospels that Jesus himself chose them. That's at Luke 6 verse 13, John 6 verse 70, chapter 13 verse 18 of John, and also chapter 15 verse 16 of John. But we can be certain that Jesus' choice was made with the insight and understanding and wisdom that came from his close, intimate fellowship with his Father. The first requirement of the apostles was that they could continually be with Jesus during his ministry. This indicates that these were men who had already proved to be ready, willing, and able to go with Jesus wherever he went, and would not be easily sidetracked by other interests or cares. Acts chapter 1 verses 21 through 22 also indicates that these apostles had, in fact, been in Jesus' presence from as long ago as the day when Jesus was baptized by John, about 1.5 years before Jesus actually selected his apostles. So even though we haven't read or heard much about these 12 men up till this point, we can still be sure that during all the events of Jesus' ministry so far, they had been there in the background, watching and listening and learning about Jesus. But Jesus had chosen these 12 from out of a larger group, so it is clear that there had been many more people who had been with Jesus during his ministry so far. And this relates or harmonizes with the fact that Jesus chose 12 to be apostles, but a little while later he also chose 70 to conduct much the same ministry as the ministry that Jesus would eventually entrust to the 12. Hopefully, we will meet most of these men in the kingdom of God. But right now, each of the 12 apostles can be given a brief introduction. These were all Jewish men and seem to have all been from Galilee. Some of them were related to Jesus, and many of them were closely related to each other. There were at least 3 sets of brothers, and 2 of the apostles were a father and son to each other. It's fairly certain that all of the apostles had known each other for some years, and I think very possible that they had all known Jesus before his ministry began, although I wouldn't be dogmatic on that point. For example, Matthew had obviously been around in Jesus' presence for quite some time, but being a despised tax collector, he had sort of kept his distance and hadn't tried to press in amongst those people that were closer to Jesus until after a year of Jesus' ministry. And Jesus had to actually call Matthew Levi to himself, and it was only then that Matthew felt free to be continually in Jesus' presence. Well, obviously the best known of the 12 apostles is Simon Peter. His original Hebrew name was Simeon, which in Greek is Simon. Jesus renamed him Cephas, or Peter, which means a movable rock or stone. He had lived in Bethsaida with his wife and mother-in-law. He had been a fisherman, and his father's name was Jonah or Jonas, not to be confused with the name John. Jonah or Jonas is quite a different name. Another apostle is Peter's brother Andrew. He was a single man who lived with Peter and his family. His name is Greek, not Jewish, so he possibly had one Greek parent, like Timothy had done, in which case he and Peter were presumably half-brothers. Andrew worked with Peter as a fisherman, and he was one of the first disciples whom Jesus called, as we can work out from John's Gospel. The other disciple whom Jesus called first was probably John, the son of Zebedee. Jesus' mother Mary was John's auntie. So Jesus and John were cousins. John had also been a fisherman in partnership with Peter and Andrew. John wrote the Gospel of John as well as 3 New Testament letters. In his Gospel, John sometimes refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Well, John had an older brother called James. James became one of Jesus' very closest apostles, along with Peter and John, and to a lesser extent Andrew. James had been a fishing partner with John and Peter and Andrew. The father of James and John was Zebedee, but Jesus called them sons of thunder. So that's 2 sets of brothers. Peter and Andrew are one pair of brothers, and James and John are the other pair of brothers. I don't know if there was any familial link between those 2 pairs of men. There is at least one other set of brothers consisting of 2 or possibly 3 or even 4 of the apostles. One of these brothers is Matthew Levi, who I mentioned a little earlier, whom we have already met. He was a publican or tax collector before Jesus called him. Matthew Levi is referred to as the son of Alphaeus. And there was another apostle who was a son of Alphaeus, and was obviously Matthew Levi's brother. His name was James. So now we have 2 apostles named James, and we'll refer to him again in a few minutes. Another apostle whose name nearly always appears next to Matthew's is Thomas Didymus, who is often referred to as Doubting Thomas because he was the last of the 12 apostles to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, the name Thomas means twin, while Didymus means double, so essentially the same meaning. One would think that the word twin implied that he had a twin sibling. Significantly, Matthew Levi's name means joined. And because of these similar names with similar meanings, twin, double, and joined, and because Matthew and Thomas's names nearly always appear together, it is quite likely that these two apostles were twin brothers. Not suggesting that necessarily they were identical twins, but that would be interesting to imagine that among Jesus' disciples there were some identical twins. Along with this list of three brothers, James, Matthew, and Thomas, there is a fourth apostle who is always connected with them, named Bartholomew. Because Bartholomew means son of Talmai, this might suggest Bartholomew had a different mother or father from the other three brothers. So maybe he was a half-brother to James, Matthew, and Thomas. I mentioned some time ago that the evidence indicates beyond reasonable doubt that Bartholomew is the same person as Nathanael, whom we meet in John chapter 1, verse 45. This indicates that Bartholomew was one of the earliest disciples to be called by Jesus. He was the disciple who thought that no good thing could come out of Nazareth. This identification of Bartholomew with Nathanael also indicates that he was from the town of Cana, if we resort to John chapter 21, verse 2. That was where Jesus performed his first sign miracle of turning water into wine. We can be almost sure that Bartholomew and James and Matthew and even Doubting Thomas were all at that wedding in Cana, and that they witnessed the sign miracle and first believed on Jesus. The Apostle James, the son of Alphaeus, he also had a son who was chosen to be an apostle. His name was Judas, and of course this was not Judas Iscariot, who eventually betrayed Jesus. The King James Version says that Judas was a brother of James, but the more correct translations accept that Judas was James's son. Now recall that this James is not the same James as the sons of Zebedee. So here is James, possibly a brother of Thomas and of Matthew and of Bartholomew or Nathanael, and he has a son. So you've got four brothers possibly and one son of this from among this four. So in view of the fact that Judas's grandfather, Alphaeus, was evidently still alive and well known to the Christians many years after Jesus' ministry, then at this time, when Jesus first called these 12 men to be apostles, Judas, the son of James, was probably quite young, possibly still in his early or mid-teens. There is no need to be amazed or skeptical about this. The Apostle Paul chose Timothy to be a fellow worker at a time when Timothy was certainly a teenager. In this case, Judas's father was probably in his late 30s or early 40s, and possibly the oldest of the apostles. So here we now have a third set of closely related apostles, possibly four brothers, James, Matthew, Thomas, and Bartholomew. That James is sometimes referred to as James the Less. We also have a son among them, Judas, the son of James. And Judas is also called Lebbaeus, or known as Thaddeus. This leaves three apostles who don't seem to have been related to any of the other apostles. Philip is the first of these remaining apostles. According to John chapter 1, verse 43, Philip was unusual in that Jesus himself actually searched for Philip to call him to be a disciple. Like Andrew, the name Philip is Greek, so it is likely that both Andrew and Philip were part Jewish and part Greek. In that case, Philip probably looked lighter and more European than the other darker Oriental apostles. This might explain why Greeks approached Philip at John chapter 12, verse 20, on a particular day very shortly before Jesus' crucifixion. Philip seems to have known Peter and Andrew, according to John chapter 1, verse 45, and this would stand to reason because they lived in the same city. Philip was evidently a close associate of Bartholomew, or Nathanael as he's also called, because Philip searched for Nathanael at John chapter 1 verse 45 to bring him and introduce him to Jesus. Well, the 11th apostle was Simon, who was called the Zealot. In Matthew and Mark's Gospels, he is referred to as Simon the Canaanite or the Canaanian, as we read in the King James Version. But the original word again means zealot and doesn't refer to the land of Canaan at all or to the town of Cana in Galilee. Simon's title, the Zealot, tells us that this apostle was, or he had been, a member of the Jewish Zealot Party, which was a revolutionary group committed to resisting Roman occupation. And if you watch a lot of TV news, as I do, you'll notice a lot of rioting going on around the world, even in Britain today. Several cities have been set on fire by rioters and caused all sorts of strife. Simon the Zealot would have been like one of those rioters. He would have been the sort that would have either been involved in some skirmish or he would have been in the background organising some plot to assassinate one of the religious or political leaders or the Romans or such like. Simon would have been the sort of person who wanted to use force to bring about the political and spiritual restoration of Israel, and he would have been violently opposed to people who tolerated or befriended the Gentiles in the Holy Land, not only in the Holy Land, but actually taking over the Holy Land and ruling the roost. The final apostle, and one of the best known, was Judas Iscariot. He is referred to as the traitor in Luke's Gospel and as the one who also betrayed Jesus or delivered Jesus up in Matthew and Mark's Gospels. Luke 22 verse 3 indicates that the word Iscariot was a label or title. Some scholars believe it refers to Judas's hometown in Judea, a place called Kerioth, but this is just a guess. And in fact, many places in Israel had the same name. It simply means a building or a cluster of buildings or a town. So any number of villages and hamlets and towns could have been called Kerioth. In fact, when I was living in Israel on a kibbutz, we were surrounded by other kibbutzim. Many of them had the name Kiryat in their name. It simply meant a collection of buildings or dwellings. Other scholars think that the name is connected to the Israelite tribe of Issachar, which occupied southern Galilee. Other scholars suggest that Iscariot was a title that Jesus had given to Judas, a title meaning a man of preaching, or possibly a man with the apron or the bag or pouch. And this would be because Jesus entrusted Judas with the disciples' money. Other scholars suggest meanings such as bribery, strangulation, or separation, which are all significant to Judas, but difficult to prove that that's actually what the name was meant to signify. Much later in the Gospels, at John chapter 12, verse 4, we learn that Judas had a father named Simon. And on the basis of this and several other passages in the Gospels, there is a case, and I believe a strong case, for believing that Judas Iscariot was the brother of 3 of Jesus' closest friends, namely Martha, Mary, and Lazarus of the town of Bethany. In connection with this theory, it would seem that the leper whom Jesus healed back in Luke 5 was actually Judas's father, a man who is later referred to in Matthew 26 and in Mark 14 as Simon the leper. Whatever else we might learn about Judas Iscariot, we can be sure that he, just like the other 11 whom Jesus chose, that Judas was suitably qualified to be a true apostle of Jesus, that is, a true ambassador or representative for him. I don't appear to have noted it in my notes, but I meant to mention that Simon is known by the name Iscariot also in John's Gospel. Jesus had seen in Judas Iscariot, and of course in the other 11 men, the sorts of personalities and characters that Jesus could make good use of. But we're not to think of these people like uncut diamonds that were almost perfect and fully formed when Jesus chose them. They were more like lumps of clay that needed to be worked and put under a lot of pressure and force to be made into the sort of people that Jesus wanted them to be. Here were men who had heard and accepted John the Baptist's call to repent and to bring forth fruits worthy of repentance. They had shown that they wished to lead lives of holiness to please and honour God. They were willing then to change. They were willing to be challenged. Here also were men who had shown during the past year and a half that they were open and receptive to Jesus' words and behaviour that were proving to be so radical and challenging and even provocative to so much of Jewish society. So far, these 12 men had not stumbled or balked at the fact that Jesus was different and unconventional and controversial. While the Jewish religious leaders had continually been offended and upset and irritated by Jesus, these 12 men had continued to trust his integrity and virtue. For a year and a half, these men had continued with Jesus, always in the background, behind the scene, among the crowds. They might not have been distinguishable by any particular traits. If Jesus was surrounded by even a small crowd, you might not necessarily pick out these 12 men as being exceptional in any way. But Jesus could tell that they would not quickly give up on him or be easily distracted from following him. This perseverance and endurance was something Jesus had noticed and appreciated. And of course, it was vital to those that would be with him over the following months and year and a half of his ministry. A few months earlier, during the Passover festival back in Jerusalem, Jesus had invited or appealed to the Jewish religious leaders to take my yoke upon you and learn of me. Those men, in the main, had refused to accept Jesus' offer. That's a sweeping statement on my part. I appreciate that many of the Jewish religious leaders would ultimately be converted, especially from among the Levites. They would obviously have been aware of much of Jesus' teaching, and that word would have gone in like a seed and been challenging to them, even though they might not have accepted Jesus or followed him during those first 3 years or so. But now Jesus had found 12 men who had shown that they would accept Jesus' invitation, and from a distance they had been learning of Jesus. And from now on, these 12 would be yoked to Jesus more closely and with greater challenges than they had known before. They would not only be yoked to Jesus, but also to each other to a greater or lesser degree. That mixture of relationships would be challenging by itself. As I say, these people were like rough clay that needed to be worked. They weren't diamonds already cut to fit together easily. And I can guarantee that none of us would necessarily have chosen the same 12 if we had been given the option. So it is today difficult to imagine that all of us would have been chosen to all be joined together. But obviously the Lord has called us all to be knit together. But imagine the 12, imagine the variety there was among them. I would like to imagine that between the 12 of them, they would have had temperament, personality, character traits, behaviours, weaknesses, strengths that we would identify with to some extent. There would be someone among the apostles with whom we could identify by their particular personality or temperament or character. There was impetuous Peter. He would easily irritate someone like cautious Thomas. Thomas would be trying to be very conservative and careful and analytical, whereas Peter would be like a bull at a gate in so many situations. Think about nationalist Simon the Zealot, the one that would be at the forefront of these riots or scheming to overthrow the Romans. He would have resented Matthew Levi implicitly. He would have wanted to slay or expel all of those people that were working for the Roman rulership. And yet, even though Matthew Levi had collaborated with the Romans, Simon the Zealot had to accept that just as Jesus had received him, so Jesus was welcoming of Matthew Levi. Legalistic Judas would have created tensions with generous Philip or with gracious John. These 12 apostles would still have a lot to learn simply by mixing with each other on a day-to-day basis. But Jesus was confident of their willingness and their ability to be taught and led and corrected and admonished. And a useful exercise for each of us is to ask whether you or I could have been chosen in the place of these men and how you would have fitted in among these 12. Now that Jesus had recruited or enlisted his special representatives, it was now a good time to begin teaching them and the multitudes more of the high calling to which they had all been called. It is at this time then, about a year and a half or halfway into his ministry, that the so-called Sermon on the Mount actually takes place. The sermon might more accurately be called the Sermon at the Mount. From Luke chapter 6 verse 20 through Matthew chapter 5 verse 2, we come to the moment when Jesus lifted up his eyes on his disciples and opened his mouth and taught them. And I'm not meaning to enter into a discussion on the Sermon on the Mount, but our brother John McIver did an extensive series on the Sermon on the Mount, and one way or another we can still resort to the record of that series. So I'll close at that point.